Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Bible for August the 29th, 2023. You're probably going to hear some pounding. This is an at-home edition while we are having new windows installed, and so I have fled to my reading nook in the bedroom to come to you for this short reflection on the Bible as we begin to follow God's wandering people to think ahead to our theme for the coming year, which is God is with us wherever we go. So, for this day, I wanted to think about Moses leading the Israelites on the Exodus and to think about what's really promised. Last week we talked about the promised land, this idea, this notion that there is a land that is a sign of the promise. And God gives that to Abraham and to all of Abraham's descendants, including not only those who are descended from those, I'm sorry, I just saw a message come through. My apologies. Those who are descended from Isaac or those who are descended from Ishmael, which means that Abraham is the father of both the Jewish and the Muslims. And of course, we all trace ourselves back to Abraham in the Christian church as well. So the father of multitudes indeed is a father of multitudes. And this promised of land has become contentious and challenging. And so I want to really investigate for just a minute what it is that God has promised and what it is that sometimes we have interpreted that promise to be. Because I think that they may have some different casts. And I'm not trying to be political. I'm not trying to be controversial on this. I think that all God's people have a right to live and to worship in ways that are consistent with what God has taught us. And that no one has got such an exclusive right to God or to any particular place that they can just claim that no one else should be there. So that said, we start out with Abraham, and then we go down through the generations of Genesis through Isaac, and then through Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is the one who wrestles with God. His story will be discussed much further during the month of September in our Sunday services, and then I'll go into some of that background. He wrestles with God and with man, and that is how he is named Israel, he who wrestles with God, the one who wrestles with God, which is the meaning of that name, Israel. Jacob has a very long and storied career, and he has a whole lot of sons through several different wives, because marriage is not one man, one woman at this point in the Bible at all. And he then has these sons that are favorites of his and sons that are less favorite. And one of his favoritist of all was Joseph. And Joseph is the one with the coat of many colors. Joseph is the one who was such a favorite that his brothers sold him off and told their father that he died, was killed by a wild beast. And Joseph goes and prepares a place through a lot of difficulties and challenges for God's people to come to Egypt during a time of famine. So that's the briefest of brief moments before I go into where we're really at. So we're in Egypt because it is famine and because Joseph wants his whole family to be together, since he has risen to great authority and princedom in the Egyptian nation. He brings them all to Egypt, and they settle in the land of Goshen, which is that triangle, that delta of the Nile River just north of Cairo. And in that land, the people live and settle, but over generations, the favor of Pharaoh towards Joseph and towards his people evaporates as one Pharaoh is supplanted by another. And there begins to be fear that the Israelites have become so numerous that they must be kept in their place. And this is when the Egyptians forcibly enslave the Israelites and force them to do a lot of building projects. And that's another whole complex story, because the Bible tells us one set of things. We can't find bricks made without straw. There are parts of this that are so lost in the distances of time. Bruce Feiler handles these things excellently in his book, Walking the Bible. And I encourage you to ferret out a copy and check it out, because it's really intriguing, where he goes back and tries to understand the story in the context of being in the place. So God finally appears to Moses, not in Moses' moment of glory, but actually when he has run away from everything, when he has discovered that he was actually an Israelite baby who was floated in the Nile and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, that he discovers that he is not at heart a prince of Egypt, but instead an Israelite. And the Prince of Egypt movie is also another really interesting take on this story. It's such a constituting story of faith for a whole lot of religious tradition. And so Moses wants to be a champion for his people, but he doesn't know how, and he ends up being hated and despised by everyone and chased out of Egypt altogether. He comes to the land of Midian, which would be modern day Lebanon and part of Syria. And in that region, in the mountains, the very volcanic mountains, he settles and becomes a shepherd. He marries, and he is living a fairly contented life. He's kind of forgotten all about all this God stuff, and a burning bush appears to him. He finds this bush that is burning and is not consumed. And this is a manifestation of God saying to him, take off your shoes. You are on holy ground. You're going to lead my people. You're going to set my people free. I've heard their cries in slavery. We are going to liberate them and bring them to a place of freedom. And Moses goes back. Now we're up to the big splashy Ten Commandments movie period. And quite a lot of that was really well researched. Of course, again, this is the dim recesses of time, 5,000 or more years ago, actually probably more like 7,000 years ago. And Moses goes through a whole lot. There's all the plagues, there's all of the issues, and finally, the last plague is the death of the firstborn, and the Spirit of God will pass over the houses that are marked as houses of the Israelites, as houses of people faithful to the God made known to Abraham. And so they paint their posts with the blood of a sacrificial lamb, and the blood of the lamb is what saves them from the scourge of death. Now, those of us who are Christian, who have just gone through the book of Revelation and other things, know that that image is going to return in much later faith iterations that trace themselves back. Pardon me, that's a saw. Traces their origins way back. Just gonna wait a moment for them to saw that window out. I have no internet reception in the place of the house that is in the quietest. Anyway. So, it's not that big a window. This could be it. So Moses leads the people out of Egypt with a great deal of the wealth of Egypt and takes them back to Midian because God has said, or back, I'm sorry, to Sinai, to the Mount Sinai, which is in the Sinai Peninsula, not unsurprisingly, where God makes promises to the people and the people make promises to God. And this is corresponded with the giving of something, and that something is not the promised land. It is the promise of the Ten Commandments. It is the promise of the Decalogue. It is the promise of what it is to be formed into God's people. Now, I have to say some things about this because the people left Egypt joyfully, but it wasn't long before being pursued by Pharaoh's armies and facing what seemed to be horrible challenges, such as the Red Sea, which was parted for them, and the beginnings of life in the desert. So that even though they were led by God's Spirit moving in a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud, even though they see the seas part, even though they receive manna from heaven every morning so that they can be sustained, even though water has been gotten from a rock, because that is how they are going to survive, they still just believe that God has taken them out there to die. This difficulty of faithfulness is not something that is new to us, and it goes all the way back to the start of the story. We have always had trouble understanding what it really would truly mean to trust one another, to trust one another, to trust in God, to trust in what God is creating among us and between us. And until, I don't know, I mean, as a Christian, I have to say, until Christ comes again in glory, that's probably not going to happen. But we need to do our best. So God's people are led. Moses goes up to the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, and the people, meanwhile, get so cowardly that Aaron finally allows them to build an idol out of the calf out of the gold from Egypt, and they make the golden calf. And that golden calf is then destroyed when Moses comes back down the mountain, all ready to seal the covenant, and discovers instead that an idol has been created when that is commandment number 2, after you will have no other gods before me. So because of all of this, God says to the people, you're going to have to wander in the desert for a while. I will make you into a great nation, but you have a lot to learn. And God's promise to them is survival. God's promise to them is that God will be their God and they will be God's people. And they are signed on to that promise. And to this day, everyone who is Jewish is seen as having stood in the presence of God at Sinai, even those who are converts to the Jewish faith. This is a mystical union, a making of a nation, a knitting together of people to become God's people, through whom God will save the world. God will work the salvation. God will begin to undo what happened in Eden. And it's a long story. Who knows where it will end? Who could have anticipated where it would have gone from that time to even our times? And yet, what we have in the Bible is a set of promises from God. Now, they get very often associated with land. So we see the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years before they can reach safety, a place of safety, before they can reach the land that God has given them to live in. But that land is not empty. The desert isn't even empty. And what God's people have to learn is how to live together as a group of people in charge of their own future, as a group of people who determine their own things, as a group of people who does not bow down to a pharaoh or to a, excuse me, there's dust, bow down to a pharaoh or to an idol, but instead learns to live creatively with these commandments that are guidelines, guide rails for what it is to live. Everywhere they go in the desert for that whole 40 years, they carry with them the Ark of the Covenant, this box that is made. There's very elaborate directions in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. It is very duplicated, as is the breastplate of Aaron that the priests wear in that scene with the Nazi commander. This story is such a critical story that it has been dealt with in multitudinous ways through the arts and certainly through cinema and many other ways. It's a big story. It is a bigger story than just saying God set us free and gave us some land. It is a story about learning to become a people, about learning to trust in God. It is a story about learning to have confidence that you can go and live in a new place even when it is a strange place and when there are strange people there. They had to stop being slaves in their minds and start instead to be a free people. Now, that area was filled with people who had lived there since tribal times, some of them with cultural connections to Abraham and some of them without. Some of them were completely different peoples. Out on the coast, there were peoples who were maritime peoples. In the desert, there were desert peoples. In the arid but fertile ground, there were other people. And the Israelites were never the only people to live in that land. And to this day, they're not the only people to live in that land. But they are seeking to live out the promise to be faithful to God, to worship God in spirit and in truth, to worship God consistent with what God has promised, and to carry with them the sign of God's presence, the tent of God's presence, as the tabernacle is known, which they erect in each new campsite, which they carry on their shoulders and they bring with them. And that tabernacle is continued until, through a series of desperate missteps under King Saul, the Ark of the Covenant is stolen. And we'll get to that maybe at some point, but it's a theme running through the whole thing. And I think I talked about this at the start, that this theme of what it is to be God's people, what it is to be in this land, what it is to be given what God gives us, and then what it is to live responsibly with it. And it is important because in the other great story, not a happy story of the Hebrew Bible, is the exile, the time when God's people from the northern kingdom are dragged away by the Assyrians and disappear, the lost tribes of Israel, and the time when the people of Judea who lived in and around Jerusalem, all of the educated class were carried away to Babylon. The temple was destroyed, and one of the things that they had to cope with in terms of being God's people, living according to God's law, is how to sing the songs of praise in a strange land, is how to obey God even when the land is calling you to do something different. And this is the story, for example, of Daniel in the lion's den. It is also the story of how God's people, when they came back changed. They came back to a place where other people were living, people who are traced as ancestors by the Palestinians. They came back knowing that they could be God's people wherever they were. They came back knowing that they would rebuild the temple, but also really struggling with whether the temple was the only place where worship could happen. And this is a controversy that lasted on into Jesus' time. And I think I talked about it in one of these some time back. So this whole idea of the promised land and what do you do with the land, how do you live in the land, is more, in my mind, about God forming a people who can live in the world than it is about these many miles and these many things. That said, Jerusalem is a remarkable, remarkable place. It is a place where you see all of these different threads come together. If God is doing something, it happens right there in Jerusalem, right there where the Transjordan Rift begins, where the earth cracks open. It happens where Muhammad was taken up to heaven. It happens where Jesus was crucified and rose. It happens where David brought the people and where Solomon built the temple. It happens where it is said that Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac and took him up the mountain. It is a place where all of God's things come to a point, and it is a place we are told to pray for peace so that all God's people may dwell together in peace. So God's promise is about peace, about safety, about living a life that is not about exerting power one over the other, but instead a way to live collaboratively, a way to live cooperatively. It is a promise that we struggle horribly to fulfill, and we probably always will, but that is the work of faith, and that is part of the purpose of religion and religious devotion, is to bring us to reconcile our transactional, greedy, tit-for-tat, I want to be the boss, meritocracy-oriented people into a vision of what it would be to live together in peace. And that will be coming up several times this coming fall. But I hope that you, along with me, will pray not only for people in places of war and disaster in these times, people who are refugees from human-made disasters such as warfare, of climate disasters. And we've got a hurricane coming to Florida. We've had fires in Maui. There have been earthquakes. It's not that long since Iraq was ripped apart by Iran. By terrible earthquakes. We don't know where the future will lead us, but what we do know is that God is our God. We are God's people. And so I invite you to go back and look at some of these stories. Go and look at some of those movies. I'll recap the Prince of Egypt, the cartoon version, in which they had the voice of God as the voices of a man, a woman, and a child, which just amazes me. Just wonderful. They couldn't make it work enough, but that was their hope. Prince of Egypt, the movie The Ten Commandments, and also go take a look at in Exodus at the description of the Ark of the Covenant and how it is to be treated, and then thoughtfully watch Raiders of the Lost Ark as they talk about what the Ark is. It was not, as they claimed, a source of domination, but it was, in fact, a way to focus the conversation with God. And so now, from my work zone, I wish you peace and happy living. We will be gathering soon for Rally Sunday, a week from this coming Sunday. I'll be talking about labor and how we do God's work on Sunday, and then on Rally Sunday we will begin to think about how God is with us wherever we are. And so that may that be true for you until we meet again.